Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Galactic Storyteller. If you are listening on my backup channel on Rumble, it is EdenRocks. As you can see, I have with me today J.R. Sweet. We are going to be doing a follow-up. Now, just per usual, I want everybody to understand that we will be covering some adult content. So if you have little ears around, please take this opportunity to either go into the other room or come back and listen another time. We're going to try to keep things on the lighter side, but I want to welcome back JR and catch up with him and see how he's been doing since our first interview. So thanks for coming back.
You got it, Madeline. Thank you for having me back.
Sure. How have things been for you?
Good. Things have been pretty good. Been a little busy,
Mhm.
working with lots of folks between work and then working on the kinds of things that we'll talk about today. It's been keeping me pretty busy. So,
Good.
yeah, so I've just been working on my journaling, working on my book, working with some other individuals, and then yeah, yeah, just keeping myself busy.
Now you're doing a book. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm working on my website. A lot of folks are familiar with that.
Mhm.
My website provides my journaled memories at no cost. They're free. I feel like it's for the public good that the information I'm providing is out there and that anyone can read it.
Yes.
The book is has all those same journaled memories in it. I'm going to put them into a book format. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I want it to be able to survive the test of time. A website only has a limited lifespan.
Mhm.
And so I would like to be able to have a hard copy. And some people prefer a hard copy,
Yes.
a book. And so I would like to finish up a book, which I've been working on, and I hope to have it done this year. It's a big undertaking. It's my goodness. I think I'm at around 450 pages on it.
Wow.
And so I'd have an introduction. My wife does a foreword, and then we go into the journaled memories that are on my website. And so it's a little different than my website in the introduction and the foreword, just because I have a wider platform to write. I can write to my leisure, and so I'm taking advantage of that. And so when I get that done, I'll add that to my website as an option. And I don't plan on making money on it. I just want to have that hard copy out there. And so that's my goal with that. So I do work on that when I can. And yeah, so that's
Really
pretty.
generous, actually. I mean, I think you should get some compensation because putting out a book is not going to be without its cost to you. But I hope the audience appreciates that it's not just you putting out this information. It does come at a cost to you emotionally, what it takes
Yeah,
for you to retell these stories and events in your life. So
yeah, I have to work through each memory again. And when I've done that, I'm editing it and updating it. And then I update the website in conjunction with it so that all the information is there. And so it takes a lot of time, and yeah, it takes a lot of emotional energy to do it. But I feel like it's a good thing to do. The more information we have, the more clear our realities can become. And
yes.
yeah, that's a goal for me.
I agree. Will you let me know when your book is due to come out?
Yes.
Because I would love to read it and let everybody know that it's available.
Nice. I will do that, Madeline. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, the last interview that you did was really successful. We had so many comments of support, but unfortunately, you were not able to address the comments yourself. For some reason, you seem to
Yeah.
be blocked.
Yeah,
And there's no
yeah.
reason on the back end why that's happening. So today, what we thought we would do is go through and read specific comments so that you could talk to them individually and answer the questions. Are you up for that?
I am. I'll answer them as best as I can.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I'm ready.
All right, so I've got a couple of pages here. We're just going to knock these out one at a time. So this is from at Julie 10696, and I'm going to read her whole statement and then give you
Okay,
an opportunity to respond. Okay.
okay.
Says, I'm so sorry you went through that. Terrible. I'm so glad you were able to free yourself from their mind control slavery. You were a beautiful, brave human being. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It makes me so furious at the arrogance and audacity of these pigs that are so cowardly and weak that they must use children for their primitive fetish sex addiction. Disgusting. More and more survivors are coming forward, which is awesome because they hate exposure and get away with their crimes because of our blindness. Their darkness they hide in like cockroaches. They hate the light because they lose control. God bless you, JR. I hope you have a full recovery and I hope you talking about it is helping your healing. We are listening. Take care of yourself. Now, the reason I wanted to read Julie's comment is because she talks about the bravery it takes to come forward and share these things, which is not an easy task. But she also talks about your healing and the fact that people are listening. Do you feel like you're being well received in your messages?
Um, that's a mixed question because yes and no. Um,
We're going to
there,
get to the nose.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and so some people are really receptive and they have a lot of understanding,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of gratitude, and I really appreciate that. I really appreciate all of the support that everyone's given. There's been a lot of support, more support than the negative comments. Um, Now, with that negative comments, I have been even threatened by individuals with such as lawsuits,
Mhm.
etc., because of the things I say. And I hold my ground because I understand that what I'm saying is true
Mhm.
and that it should be heard. Now, with that said, everything that I'm going through and working through, there are little nuances and little things that I will get incorrect. And that takes courage in my mind to accept that, okay, I might be wrong here and there,
Mhm.
but for the most part, I understand that what I'm saying is true. And I'm trying my hardest. I'm giving it everything I got to understand that truth, and I'm going through the process even of investigating some of these things in order to come to the bottom of exactly what happened in certain circumstances and to gain a full understanding, which is very difficult and very painful. And so, when I first started working through my memories, I understood that it's really difficult. And sometimes your own mind, it's difficult for it to process the information. And so your mind will even create things in order to try to explain to your conscious mind what happened. And so it's a very difficult and painful process. My ego has been destroyed. I don't have much ego left.
Yeah.
And so that leads me to the individual Bill's Bob's comment. Now, Bill's Bob, he's I don't think he likes me. I'll just put it that. But Bill's Bob raised some very good points. Do you have his comment,
I do.
Magdalene?
Let's jump to that. This is from at Bill's Bob. I was
Yeah.
listening Let's see. I was willing to listen to all 2 hours and not dismiss anything I heard, except where he stated verifiably false facts about easy details regarding the Fairfield branch, not ward, and their branch president, Todd Rasmussen, who is not a bishop. Also, that the bishop's storehouse is a warehouse in Twin Falls, stocked by delivery from Welfare Square, not by individual bishops, and that Thomas Helicopters, in parentheses, Crop Duster Company, would not fly to Fairfield to store cocaine when any party animal in Haley could just have it flown into the Haley private airport, and more than likely that cocaine would have been coming from Boise, not Gooding County, where Thomas Helicopters is based. A modicum of effort to verify and validate some of the claims would go a long way to lending credibility to a very incredible story. I can't be the only listener who grew up in that area around the same time who can dispute some of JR's claims. What say you
Yeah.
on that?
No, that's awesome. Like, I really appreciate actually his comment. It's changed. What you just read is different than what I remember when I first saw that comment. It's a little bit more elegant, I would say. But I appreciate Bill's Bob's comment because he's right. Todd Rasmussen was a branch president, and in Fairfield it was a branch and not a board. And so
Okay.
he has some very valid points. And so for me, I'm looking for the truth. And
Mhm.
that memory, I haven't fully written it out yet. And so the things that he talked about, it was awesome because it helped to spark my memory. And I was like, oh, yeah, it was so tiny, this little building with
Yeah.
these elderly people. And yeah, it was great. But Thomas Helicopter, I never said Thomas Helicopter.
No, I don't think
And
so.
no, I know I didn't. And I don't know that it was Thomas Helicopter. And I don't claim to know anything about Thomas Helicopter. And so I make no accusations against Thomas Helicopter. He also, Bill's Bob had mentioned that they wouldn't be moving coke, they'd be moving meth. But that's incorrect. I know they were moving coke. And so, that's just how it is. They were moving coke. And so, but I really appreciated his comment.
Yeah.
Sometimes, I learned in life that you have to piss some people off in order to
Yeah.
show others that you're serious. For example, you can't have an emotional scale of one way and not the other. And so when people get really mad, it doesn't bother me. It's
Yeah.
like, what do you have to add what do you have to add to the conversation? And so he really added to the conversation. And it took me a little while. At first when I saw that, I was like, oh man, it hurts. Like, he's so brutal. But the more I thought about it, I was like, man, this is great though. He's really helpful. And so I'm going through some stuff now where I'm really trying to work some things out. And
Mhm.
it's painful when you're incorrect about something, but you understand that you are correct about this. And so there's a lot of things I'm trying to work out still.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I thought that was a great comment.
Well, whether it's cocaine or meth, that's tomato, tomato. Does
Yeah,
that specific thing really matter? But what I want people to understand is when you're going through the process of recovering memories, there might be the essence or the emotion of what happened that's coming through, and that's what you need to pay attention to. But some of the details might not always be 100% accurate, especially when you have to take into consideration that you have been electroshocked throughout your life. How many times?
I
Hundreds?
yeah, I don't even know. I would say
Hundreds?
more than hundreds. I would say
Yeah.
thousands of times.
And that messes with your neurological system and how the synaptic process is firing between the right and the left hemisphere. So, especially if you've got disassociation going on, it takes a little while for the finer details of those memories to become more accurate.
Yeah, yeah, it does. It takes a really long time. It takes months and even years work through these memories. And so that memory of moving cocaine, I'm still working it out. You know, I worked on it today, and it'll take me months, if not a year or two, to work through it. It just takes a really long time.
So rather than
And
being pissed off at Bill's Bob, you can say thank you for helping you reframe
yeah,
that experience.
yeah. I'm like, great, thank you. That is awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I don't mind a bit.
Fantastic. Well, let's go to Earthskin 3137. Grew up in the Mormon Church and there's a darkness there. I wish my family could see. They have made it incredibly hard to get my records removed. I've heard another story from a survivor saying she saw Hinckley in the tunnels under the Salt Lake City temple with a full-blown ritual sacrifice going on. How surprised are you to hear that?
Not at all. Yeah, not at all. There's a lot of people who know a lot of things,
Mhm.
and yeah, that doesn't surprise me a bit. Hinckley didn't seem to be a very good man to me. Yeah, nor Monson or Airing. And it,
This is why it's so important for individuals to come forward. What information you have, the pieces that you have that can provide wholeness to the overall big picture just might be compartmentalized for you. But as you share, somebody else comes forward and says, well, I have these pieces. I know this information. And so as everybody does that and we work together, we can create a better, more well-rounded picture of what's really happening.
yeah, yeah, I would agree. We're able to synthesize all the information and put it together and gain a clearer understanding. A lot of folks, I live in society. I watch people all day, and I watch their state of mind, and what they talk about and what they focus on in their life. And people focus on what they're used to, and they're able to understand and comprehend. And if you never take yourself outside the bounds of what you can comprehend and understand, then you will always only understand and comprehend what you do. And so all the pieces coming together really helps expand the human consciousness in order to be able to understand what's happening in the world, because it's not what we think it is.
Yeah,
There's the reality that we live in is not black and white. I'm a patriotic individual. I love my country, but I understand that there is some evil persons in the government that are working fervently at controlling the people, and they have no moral or ethical guiding values, at least none on a positive nature. And so, yeah, I feel like it's really important. I hear from a lot of survivors too. It's difficult to respond to them all because sometimes it's just really painful, and I don't quite know how to even respond. But I hear from quite a few survivors, and they're in my prayers, and I think about them, and I apologize to any of them I may not have responded to. uh, yeah, there's a lot of response to it in a positive way, so that's
good.
good.
Well,
Yeah,
I didn't write this one down, but somebody had asked me if you had been in contact with Christy Allen. Have you guys connected at all?
yeah, yeah, I know Christy. She's a really sweet lady. Yeah, I love Christy. She's so nice. And so, yeah, I get into contact with Christy once in a while. And when there's something that I want to talk about that I know a lot of people have a hard time with, yeah, I'll call Christy. And yeah, So
She's very well educated, self-educated, and I will tell you that sometimes, even though there's outside support for survivors, sometimes there can be a good and a bad side to connecting with survivors, because you guys can support each other in a way that nobody else really understands. And at the same time, I would imagine you guys have to be incredibly mindful of possible triggers for one another, or making sure that you're not being triggered
yeah,
by talking about the events. Is that correct?
yeah, that is correct. And so we will talk. And for me, I try not to talk about things that might be a trigger. We do talk about some controversial things sometimes, but um, yeah, I try not to, because I wouldn't want to do that to Christy. And it's also difficult because you don't want your own memories to become polluted with someone else's.
Mhm.
And so that's something that as a survivor you have to be aware of. And so it is a difficult balance. And so that brings me to support groups. There's support groups out there that work with folks, and that's good if that works for folks. But for me, I can't see myself doing that, because I wouldn't want my own memories to become entangled with someone else's. They're difficult enough to work through without that. And so I really try to limit my media, the movies I watch.
Yes.
Sometimes I consider, like maybe I should watch Disney's Alice in Wonderland just to remember, but no, I have to stay away from it because yeah,
I
because
didn't
of
even like
that.
that movie as a kid. Now that I know what
Yeah,
it's about, I'm really
yeah,
not watching it.
yeah, not a good film. Heavily used in mind control. Yeah, so I have to really be careful with that. Yeah,
I would
but Christy's a
imagine
sweet lady.
I would imagine that that was part of your specific Disney programming, given some of the artwork that your wife shared with us, your wife Kate's story. So
Yeah,
that's part of your programming.
it was a very heavy part of my programming. Yeah, very heavy. There was always a girl when I would go to Disneyland and be taken under the park. I would always meet a girl down there, and that was Alice. Sometimes it was the same girl for a couple years, um, and they'd always be in a costume, and they were always these beautiful, nice girls. But we'd be made to do awful things together, in front of people there. Um, and so, yeah, that was a big part of my programming was Alice in Wonderland. And even in my regular life, Madeline, I can remember, for example, when I first started to remember these things back in 2017, when it started to come back. I remembered an incident where this was just in normal life. I was a teenager, an older teenager. I must have been 16, 17 years old. And I was like, I'm going to watch Alice in Wonderland, And so I'm sitting in the living room, and then I wanted to become intoxicated. And so I went into the kitchen and I got some cough syrup, and I drank some cough syrup in this little cup. And the cough syrup was a bright color, and I got a little messed up on cough syrup. I realized this stuff's all like crazy and just disgusting, but this was what my mind was trying to communicate to me, because I would be given drugs, potions that were brightly colored, and they were usually in this little bottle with a little cork, and we called them potions. And so I had created my own little environment unconsciously that represented what I went through with my programmers. And so I always found it weird that, I had done that for years. I was like, why would I watch Alice in Wonderland and want to
Almost
drink
like you
coffee?
were being your own handler.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that my subconscious was trying to communicate to me, because when they're compartmentalized through hypnosis and electrocution, you don't remember it on a conscious level, but your subconscious mind will be nagging at you.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the knacks by my subconscious mind. So yeah, so Alice in Wonderland was a big part of my programming, yeah, and Alice. And there was one year, um, yeah, sometimes you'd be made to do awful things, yeah, down there with Alice. And yeah, yeah.
We don't have to get into all of that. Let's go on to John Bystrom, 9410. How many never survived to get the chance to expose them?
Yeah,
What do you think of
yeah,
that? Because that's pretty,
that's pretty heavy.
yeah.
Yeah, he's a smart guy.
Mhm.
And I remember when I was young, um, my grandfather, he would round up people like me. I can remember that. And they would look for people like me and try to round them up, those who were starting to remember. You're most vulnerable at that moment when you start to remember. Those first days, weeks, months are critical to your survival. That's a time when you have got to be diligent about who you're talking to, who your calls are coming from, who you're calling, where you're at, who you're with. You have to be very aware of those things because that's their window to get rid of you. And so I can remember my grandfather hunting people and getting rid of them or bringing them back into the network, even when I was a child. I haven't written those things out. Those are mostly flashes that I have to deal with, but that was a situation. And so, yeah, there's a lot of folks. I had one of my friends when I first started to remember, and I was remembering this individual, Chris Knutson. I looked him up because I wanted to talk to him about what we had lived through, only to discover he was dead. He had supposedly committed suicide. And I don't believe that storyline. It's a great excuse for death. And he was said to have died through fentanyl and some kind of other drug overdose. And he would have had to have drank a whole bottle and slapped a fentanyl patch on himself. And I just don't see that. He was pretty messed up in the head, but they got rid of him, as well as his older brother, Steve. They got rid of him too. They did a lot of testing with drugs and stuff on Steve, and he ended up in a hospital, some kind of mental hospital, and then he was dead. And so, yeah, there's a lot of folks that don't make it this far. It's a miracle of God that I'm even still alive. I can remember several times they tried to kill me out in public, at my home. They sent people in with triggers to trigger my suicide programming, and I had to deal with that. And that was extremely painful. But when I understood what I was going through, I was able to work through it. And so, and if you're consciously aware enough to understand that you lived through something really bad and that your mind might even be at risk, then you watch all those things and pay attention. Here's an example, Madeline. I was put through suicide programming by my uncle. This was right after assassination attempt in Boise, Idaho. I was supposed to shoot this guy in front of the Neurolux. Well, it didn't happen. It was a mission failure. And my programming had broken down because I'd been smoking a little bit of marijuana with some friends of mine a couple days before. I don't know if we talked about that or not before. Yeah, and so my programming, it had broken down, and my uncle, he was paranoid about me and my programming after that because they don't want to be exposed. It's one of their worst fears. And so he put me through suicide programming, and I was made to come into his office. I was supposed to be working at his house, and he brought me into his office. He had me sit down. He got out a Glock 19, a compact 9mm handgun, and he was said, "Do you want to see something?" That's what he'd always say. "Do you want to see something?" And I was a young man and I liked firearms. And so he got it out and he was showing it to me. And then he made me sit down and he put the gun in front of me and he made me pick it up. First, he triggered me. into another personality, and then he made me pick it up, and then he made me hold it. He made me load it around, and then he made me hold it to my head, and then he made me feel the safety on the trigger, and he made me hold the trigger. And he went through the process of programming me that if I ever talked about my involvement with the agency, that I would shoot myself with a Glock 19. And so when I started to remember these things in 2017, I I realized that I was a sleeper assassin for the Central Intelligence Agency, and I said to myself, my God, this is terrible, but I need some way of protecting myself because these people are going to want to kill me. And my grandpa used to tell me that. I have stories I could talk about of that. They're going to come after you. And so what did I do? I went and I bought a Glock 19. That was one of the first things that I did. And
To protect yourself from them, but really you're operating off of your program.
yes,
Okay, got it.
exactly. Yep. And so after my friend, who I hadn't seen in years, called me and said he wanted to come visit. This was a friend, um, Christopher Cahoon, who was a childhood friend, and he's also a mind slave. And he brought a trigger for that programming. And so he came to visit me in Idaho and came out to my house, and we sat down and we talked, and he triggered me with that programming. And then he left that night. And the next morning, I woke up and I was like, what is wrong with me? Something's wrong in my head. I knew because I wasn't right, and I was considering such things as suicide. And I told myself, you need to go take a walk, because I knew that I'd been involved with some bad things. And I knew my mind had really been messed with, and that I was a survivor of the Central Intelligence Agency's trauma-based mind control program. And so I went for a walk and I was able to walk it off. Well, shortly after that, I began to remember that suicide programming that I just told you about. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, oh, geez, no wonder I bought that weapon. And it was almost impulsive the way it felt buying it. And as soon as I remembered why I bought it, I sold it immediately to a good friend of mine there in Idaho. I said, okay, I don't want that around. And so, yeah, I got rid of that. The
How
Glock
old were you?
19, that was in the year 2000.
Okay.
And and so I must have been right around 21 years old, 2021 when that occurred. Yeah.
Isn't that fairly early for programming to start breaking down? And maybe you can speak more on this, because my understanding is once an individual hits around 30, the programming for some reason starts to break down. You get memory bleed throughs. And so that's when individuals get thrown from the freedom train, as it will, which is a code phrase for they're offed, or they follow through with their suicide programming. So
Yeah.
it isn't 21 a little bit early for those memories to start coming through?
Um, Now, are you asking me when I remembered the suicide programming, or
Yes.
when the suicide programming occurred?
Well, let's do both.
Okay, so this that's good. Thank you,
Cover it
Mary.
all.
Yeah, so in the year 2000, my programming broke down, like I said, because I'd smoked a little bit of marijuana. A lot of people may not know, but marijuana, I was fed volumes of drugs in the project. You can read documentation about the project and about all their drug testing and all of that. Well, when I came along, they were, I would say they were done with testing. They had it really well defined. And so I was fed volumes of drugs. There were drugs that made you angry, drugs that made you glad, drugs that made you relax, drugs that made you more alert. And so, and they would mix them, and we called them potions. And so I was fed volumes of drugs, but you were not allowed to have marijuana. This was the one drug that I was always told when I was in an alter personality that I wasn't allowed to have. I do remember people telling me, well, you're not allowed to have that. Like Todd, for example, he sold me some marijuana one time. I worked for him, and he he was selling me some marijuana, and I sat down in his truck with him, and he had this giant bag, and I started taking some and putting it in another bag, and he sits there and he kind of thinks for a second, and he says, now you're not supposed to have marijuana, because someone had told him, but he didn't understand why. And
Oh,
so, and I said, no, dude, no, that's wrong. And I just, I bought some marijuana from him. And he didn't fully understand the reasoning nor how much he should enforce that, though he was aware that I wasn't supposed to have that. And so that was the one drug. And so that was why my programming broke down in the year 2000.
I see.
There were other times I can remember breaking through the programming. Our spirits are strong,
Mhm.
and they can break through even trauma-based mind control programming. And I can remember being, for example, in Disneyland and my grandfather brutally murdering a young person in front of me, and screaming, I'm going to tell on you. I'm going to tell on you. You can't do that. Well, something happened after that. That was awful. And my memory was, I haven't written that out entirely. And so there are times when you try to break through, but then they were repressed again. In 2017, when I was 37, and these things started to fully come back to me, I would say, um, I was able to remove myself from my abuse base. And so one of the things I did was communicate with my family. And so I'm curious about things. And so um, I communicated with my father some when I first started to begin to remember, and I was confused. And I texted my father, and I said, there's something I want to ask you. And he said, what is it? You can ask me anything. So I asked him, I said, Dad, who was the movie producer for my grandfather's story? I don't know if you're familiar with that part of my journaling or how much I journaled on that on my website, but my grandfather has a story where he met an individual in Los Angeles at 2 in the morning. He was at a bus stop at 2 in the morning in LA, and a limousine pulled up to the bus stop, and the window rolled down, and there was a man in the limousine that he recognized, and he said, the man in the limousine said, do you want to go for a ride, young man? I want to talk to you for a minute. And so my grandfather, having recognized this individual as a very famous movie producer, he just got right into the limousine, and they started to take a ride around the block. Well, my grandpa, he'd always told the story that he rode around the block with this guy, and this guy started to tell him about all the people he'd made famous throughout history, or not throughout history, but through his lifetime and his career,
Uh-huh.
and all the people in film that he had brought up and made famous, and how he really liked the way my grandfather looked, and he could make him famous. And then it came to the point where the deal was my grandfather would have to be basically this man's man whore, and he would have to be his sex partner, because that's what this gentleman was doing at 2 in the morning, driving around. And so my grandpa, according to his story, he said that he always told us that he told the gentleman no and demanded that he let him off at the bus stop, and left him alone. He didn't have anything to do with it. And so the gentleman dropped him off at the bus stop and went away. And my grandfather would never tell us who the movie producer was. We'd ask as children when he'd tell us this story, who was the movie producer, Grandpa? Well, he'd never tell us. And so I'd asked my father this question before when I visited him. It must have been around, oh, I'm not even sure when, Madeline, probably early 2000s, mid 2000s, right around in there somewhere. And I'd asked him on a visit, Dad, who was the movie producer? And he had told me that he knew who it was, but he was not going to tell me because he had promised my grandfather that he wouldn't. And then he walked off and he was angry about it. And so I found this very confusing because my grandfather had already passed away. I assumed that the movie producer would have passed away. What does it matter? Like, why would that be such a big deal? And so I texted my father in 2017 when I was starting to remember all these weird things. And I asked him, I said, who was the movie producer? And he responded with, I don't know, which instantly sent a red flag to me because he was lying, because
Okay.
he had told me before, I know, but I'm not going to tell you. And so instantly I understood that he was lying. And I said, I know you're lying. You do know. You're not telling me why. And I said, why? I want to know why. This man must be dead. Grandpa's dead. Why can't you tell me this? And then he just texted back and said, call me. You just need to call me. Well, I didn't call him. I had my answer to my question that I couldn't trust my father. When I was young, very young, I must have been around 08 or 09. I'm not entirely sure. My grandfather also told us a story about trust uh, between me and my little brother, who is in the project as well, and my younger cousin, who is in the project. And in that story, do you mind if I tell that story?
No, I don't. But what I want to know, and I think what the viewers might be asking themselves, is if this is the same grandfather as Jim Reeves, or is this a,
Yes,
oh, okay, so we are talking about Jim Reeves,
yes,
the
we are.
persona of Jim Reeves.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
yeah. And so we can get to that too. Yeah, because I know some people made comments about that.
Well,
And
we got
that
to
is,
talk about that.
yeah, let's go to that actually, because
Okay.
that's a really, it's a tough one for me because it's a mind bender. But I can remember so many things about my grandfather and that individual. And so go ahead. You go ahead and you read me one of the comments. And
Well, I don't have them written down on those just simply because there were several regarding their surprise that one, Jim Reeves was involved. He seemed so wholesome. I do remember that one of the comments revolved around, and I'm paraphrasing, how is it that Jim Reeves could have this wholesome persona to the public and be involved in such an insidious industry behind the scenes?
well, the satanic elite and Satanists work in opposites. It's the same with the LDS Church. A lot of people perceive the LDS Church as this overwhelmingly good organization. And the church does do a lot of good. And there are a lot of good people in the church, but it makes it a really good place for really evil people to hide
Mhm.
because it is the opposite of what they are. And you would never even imagine. Disneyland is the same way. It's so overwhelmingly good and joyful on the surface to all the children that go there and get to experience it. But for all the children who experience the other side, the opposite, Satanists operate in opposites. That's why the star is inverted and upside down, for example. The trigger, this is a trigger. And so anyone listening, I would warn them, up is down. This was a big trigger in my life. Up is down. When up is down, good is bad, bad is good. It's okay to kill, it's okay to rape. That's Satanism, opposites. And so yeah, it is a complete opposite. Charlie Pride was the same way. A lot of people love Charlie Pride, think he's the most wonderful person in the world, and the most wonderful musical artist. And he had his musical skills and talents, and he probably was a good person on one side. But that doesn't mean he was all good. Could also be a really evil, sick, twisted, disgusting individual.
I have a
And
comment here about Charlie Pride we're going to get to in just a second.
okay, yeah, but Jim Reeves, I'd like to explain to people a little bit why I say my grandfather is Jim Reeves. What do I remember that would make me say such a thing? And there's several things I can remember. One is meeting Randy Travis in 1993. That's under the journal memory, heading east. And I haven't quite finished that one. There were some things I ran into in that memory that really threw my mind for a loop that I'm trying to understand. And I don't know how to explain it other than Randy wasn't with his wife, for example. He was with another woman in his house, and she had dark hair. And but I met Randy, and Randy, that was when we were leaving for our trip back east. That was the year I was sold to the CIA. And so when we left Idaho and we were headed back east, we stopped at Randy's house. He owns several houses, that's my understanding. He invests his money really good. Randy's really good with money, and he buys property and homes. That's where he puts his money. And so he had a home outside of Burley, Idaho, to the south of Burley, Idaho, out in the plain there. There's mountains on the edge, and then there's this plain area. And he had a house out there, and we went out there because Randy managed my grandfather's money, which was money from the royalties from the songs that he had done as Jim Reeves. And so we went out and visited Randy, and we were there for probably half hour, 45 minutes, hung out with Randy and this other woman, and had some lemonade. I can remember having ice lemonade, and we did a guitar lesson with Randy, which was fun. But I didn't know who Randy was at that time. I could have cared less. I was a kid. I was like, I don't even know who he is, which embarrassed my grandfather when we left. He was like, "You don't even know who Randy is?" He felt like he'd done something wrong with us because I had no idea at that age. Yeah, but he managed my grandfather's money, and he gave him an envelope full of money because we were going on this trip and he needed some money for the trip. And so he'd go out and visit Randy in Burley when he needed money because he was bringing in money through royalties. And so that was something that I've worked through. And I'm just trying to iron out some of the details in because I don't understand who the woman is. And at some point with memory, Madeline, you just have to say, okay, I'm not going to remember. And
Mhm.
when I do, I'll update it. And so I may need to just finish that one up and put it out there. And then I also met Garth Brooks's grandmother, or they, see, that's the problem with that one too, is I'm like, but she wasn't his grandmother, like as far as a blood relation. It
Mhm.
was some kind of, I don't understand the relationship there. And so that one I've been working through, but I'm leery to publish because I don't completely understand who that woman was. So, and so those people like Randy, he called my grandfather Jim, you know, and so he knew him as Jim. Um, and
Was
then
he a
another,
handler in some way? Do you think that it was possible that Randy Travis could have been Jim's handler or one of the people managing him if he was in control of his money?
I don't know the answer to that, Madeline. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, but I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Yeah. And then another thing that I remember is that same year, we were taken down to Texas on this same trip, and I was taken to Fort Worth, down there outside Dallas is Fort Worth. And we stayed outside Dallas the first night when we got down there. This was the night after I was made to play the most dangerous game. And so we went down to Dallas, and my cousin and I were pretty sick from what we'd lived through in the most dangerous game. And we were throwing up, and it was a pretty awful experience. But my grandparents, they didn't have much empathy for that. And that night we went to Dallas and stayed in a hotel, and Bird and his wife came to visit my grandfather and my grandmother there in the hotel. And they hung out for quite a while and they talked. And then Bird, he took me and my cousin to a military base in Fort Worth. It was a naval base of some kind, and we were taken into that base, and I was put through some voice programming. I can remember being made to sing, and he was working on my voice, and stuff like that. Well, the next day, didn't get much sleep, pretty awful experience actually. But that base, it was pretty weird, Madeline. We got onto the base, and you go through the normal security checkpoints, and then we went to a facility that was off limits to everybody else. But in that facility was it was a closed off area in a building that actually had an apartment in it, as well as a room for programming, so that the programmers could work on programming and take breaks in their apartment and in their kitchen. And so Bird took us there, and he worked us over all night, my cousin and I. And then the next morning, we were taken to the Jim Reeves Memorial. And so my grandparents drove my cousin and I out to the Jim Reeves Memorial there in Texas. And it was ways away from Dallas because Bird brought us back to Dallas where my grandparents were. And then we drove out to this Jim Reeves Memorial, and we spent some time there. I remember walking around with my grandma. Bird came and his wife, they also met us there. And Bird and my grandfather, they wanted to talk to my cousin and I individually there. And so my cousin talked to my grandpa and Bird first, and then it was my turn. And I went up, and they were standing by this figure. There's a statue of Jim Reeves there. And my grandfather said to me, "Doesn't that guy look familiar?" And I looked at the statue, and I was like, "No, dude, like, who is that guy?" Like, you know, and he said, "Well, that's me. I played that character. That's me." And so this place, this Jim Reeves Memorial, it was really important to him, because that was a memorial to him and to that character that he played for the country music industry, as well as for the intelligence community. The intelligence community is really connected with the country music, the rap, all of those, the rock, all of that. There's a lot of mind slaves in music. A lot
Yes.
of those people are mind slaves. Brooks is a mind slave. Billy Joel, I remember meeting Billy Joel. There's a place in Disneyland under the park where bands will play before they're out and really public. They're able to play in these on these other venues, and they'll play like under the park in these off limits areas where most people aren't allowed to go, but there will be parties and stuff. And so I met Billy Joel under the park in that way. He was playing down there. And my grandpa, he just called him Billy. He loved Billy. He gave him a big hug and a big kiss. And yeah. And so, but I was taken out to this Jim Reeves Memorial and told that I was Jim Reeves. That is who I was in that life.
So was this after he had his public persona death? That this
Yes.
Okay, great. I have a couple of questions surrounding what you mentioned. One of the viewers asked me if you know anything about Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings.
Yeah. Johnny, I don't know a lot. Johnny knew some things, but I don't remember Johnny ever doing anything bad to
Okay.
me. I had met Johnny in Memphis, Tennessee in that same year, and he was in a music studio in Memphis. And my grandfather, he also wrote music. And so he would sell it to different artists in the country music industry. And he wrote a song. I can remember my grandpa singing this song to me on the drive and talking to me about it and being like, "What do you think?" And so we talked about it and we went and saw Johnny Cash in a studio in Memphis. And my grandpa sold him the song, is what he did. And so I just met him for a minute. He was in the studio and he seemed like he knew who my cousin and I were. We were what was called CIA kids.
Okay.
And so I can remember being called that. There was one time I was riding with my cousin out of Nashville or in Nashville, and we were with this individual. He was a sheriff there in Tennessee. Forget his name, but he knew that my cousin and I were CIA kids. And he said that in the car. We were riding to the store in his Cadillac, and he asked the question. He said, "How's it going with the CIA kids?" Me and my cousin were sitting in the back seat. And my grandpa, he got pissed and he says, "You're not supposed to talk about that." and and this guy, he was a little shocked, because people don't understand, like they're given these little rules: don't let them smoke marijuana, don't talk about how they're involved with the project, these kinds of things, because it messes with our heads. We're not supposed to even go there in our conscious mind. And so my cousin, he says, "Grandpa, you're involved with the CIA?" And my grandpa, he's up there just like, geez, this guy has completely blown it. And so my grandpa says, "Yeah, you want to see my badge?" or something to that effect. And my cousin's like, "Yeah, yeah." And I'm like, "Yeah, you got a badge, Grandpa?" Like, we're like, we didn't know. We were in our conscious minds, and we weren't switched, and we were just in our base personality. And so my grandpa, he turned around. Well, he didn't have a badge, he had a taser, and he hit my cousin and he hit me, and we both just went out like a light. And so those people don't always understand everything. um yeah, and so, but I'm not sure if Randy was involved with handling my grandfather. Did I answer your question okay?
From my understanding, it sounds like maybe Johnny Cash was aware of what was going on, possibly, but you don't know exactly what his role was. Is
No,
that correct?
that's correct.
Okay. And
Yeah,
anything on Waylon Jennings?
I don't know. I met another individual in, I believe it was New Mexico. It was a musical artist. Um, I I want to. I can't tell you who it was.
Okay.
I've written that out and I've tried to work through it, but there were some things that were really bad that happened, and I just haven't invested a lot of time into it. It
And you
was a
can't force those memories. You have to let
no.
it go in order for it to flow, if it's going to.
Yes, it's the opposite of what you want. Back to
Right?
opposites. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me give you a comment by Felicia 7358, because this is regarding some of the things that you were just talking about. JR, have you been in contact with Kathy O'Brien, since you both seem to have so much in common? Charlie Pride, Alex Houston, Senator Byrd, The Most Dangerous Game.
Yeah. I talked to Kathy a little bit when I first started to remember it. I was in a state of shock when I first started to remember these things, and I didn't know who to talk to. And so I wrote to Kathy, and she wrote back. She's a really nice lady, and she wrote back, and said, "I'm glad you're healing." Um, but what I found interesting was, I was just beginning to remember these things, and I felt like I must be losing my mind or something. And she said that I was well along my healing path. And I was like, no, dude, no,
Am
I'm
I
not.
it?
Yeah, like this has just hit me. Like, I don't even know how to deal with it, you know? And so I would imagine that she is inundated with people trying to talk to her. And so I haven't talked to her much after that. We had a few email conversations
Okay.
and that was about it. Yeah, but whenever I would contact Kathy, it was always interesting. I knew that the helicopters were coming, and it was usually within, I would say, 2 hours after contacting Kathy that there would be helicopters, and that was those first, like I said, few months and weeks and days of me really understanding and coming to some clarity of what I'd lived through. And so
Wow.
found that interesting. And I can remember my grandfather and Bird talking about Kathy and Mark.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah, when I was in, I don't remember exactly where I was, Madeline. I was at some kind of war memorial, and this was in '93. And this is when I'd been sold to Bird and Central Intelligence Agency. We met, my grandparents took my cousin and I to this war memorial to meet with Bird. And so we went to the memorial and talked to, we met with Bird near the flower garden area at this place. And my grandfather and Bird talked some. After Bird took us off, he took us away, me and my cousin individually, and he tested me for disassociation. You were tested periodically. This was a time when I was tested because I was being sold to Bird. And he wanted to know for himself damn well that I was going to dissociate. So he took a nail and he shoved it through my wrist, and he stuck, I can see the scars. It goes through
Right
here and out.
here or where?
It goes through here, right here at this location. And I do have these images on my website. And then
Okay.
it came out over here in
Oh,
this area.
okay.
Yeah. And so he took that nail and he just shoved it right through. He moved me into an altar before he did that, but the conversation was very satanic. He talked about how I was possessed by a great warrior, someone in the military from the Civil War. There was a lot of Satanism, a lot of demonic things like that. And so he talked about those things and he shoved that through my wrist, and I disassociated. I didn't even feel it. I watched him do it. And I remember thinking to myself, you better not screw up, because do you have any idea who I am and how much money they have paid, you know? Because there's a high value on people like me in the Central Intelligence Agency. And then after he had pulled that nail out of my wrist, he took a knife and he carved up my arm. And so I have some scars on my arm where he carved two dots, and those dots represent US military. I'm US property. And
Oh,
so those are the two dots that you would see in a U dot S dot. I'm US government property. And so that was the branding that I received for who I am and who owns me. And so, and those things were checked on me at later times in my life to verify my identity. But after Bert had done these things, we went back to my grandparents, and they talked for a while. And they talked about Kathy and Mark because Kathy was the one that got away. And boy, did she put a ruffle under their feathers. They were so pissed at her because of what Mark and her had done, and her ability to get away and how she escaped. And they talked about how she was going to be publishing a book and that all these things were coming out. And so that was really an interesting conversation that my grandfather and Bird had. But see, Bird, he called my grandfather Dwayne. That's what Bird called my grandpa all the time, was Dwayne. because my grandfather's name is Mark Dwayne Sweet, and so he would call him Dwayne. So
Okay, I have three questions. So we'll knock those out one at a time. Do you think that it is significant spiritually that they chose to use a nail through the wrist?
I don't know the answer to that. I
Okay.
would think yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Second question, there has been suspicion that Mark was quite possibly Kathy's handler for information control. Do you have an opinion on that or not? Or can you say unequivocally that he actually was her rescuer the way she says, or do you happen to not know? I've always wondered. I've had my suspicions, I have to say.
Yeah, yeah, and I've had my own suspicions as well. And there's a lot of stuff out there that would say that. But from that experience that I had with Bird and that conversation, I would say no,
Okay, good.
no. And another reason that I say that is because of all the information that Kathy has been able to share. It's with the world. I don't know that I would have remembered what I remember if my brain hadn't have been jostled by Kathy's work.
Oh, wow.
I
And
don't know that I would have been able, yeah, to synthesize what I was remembering to understand what it was.
mm,
Does that make sense?
of course,
Because
yeah.
she does a great job of synthesizing it and bringing it to the point. And so I understand why people would say that. And in this arena, um, there's not a whole lot of folks I trust.
Mhm.
And so for Kathy to trust Mark like she did, I don't think that he was a bad man.
I'm so glad to hear that because she has really been the catalyst for a lot of information sharing and awakening about the MK Ultra program. So I'm genuinely relieved to hear your opinion is that Mark was really an advocate for her.
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah.
Excellent. So the third question I had actually ties into a comment or a question from Angela Rasmussen, 1800. She actually has two questions, two comments. So we'll take the first one. It says, why did he constantly, meaning you, spell us U.S? Also, I'm looking for his wife's story. Okay, so that's a different thing. So I think you just answered that with you were spelling in your Monarch program website. Anytime you say us, you have U.S, and that was your brand. You
Yeah, that
owned
was
by the CIA, correct?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
correct. And so there are times when I won't use that format. I'll just write lowercase us, but when I'm working at making that point, yes, yes. And that's because I'm US government property or we're on US government work.
Okay. Because I
Yeah.
wondered that too when I was reading through your website, and I knew there had to be a meaning for that. So
Yeah, people
thank
ask
you,
me that.
Angela.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Our last comment comes again from Angela. She has questions about Jim Reeves. Can we know his real name? I think you mentioned that, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that what he used with his family, with Johnny, with the other dark life that he lived? How did he manage his LDS background? Because I don't think anyone knew Jim Reeves and I'm trying to read through typos and things.
Yeah.
I think it's just LDS. So how did that work? Also, does JR know anything about his grandfather or his father's abuse, like what he went through to make them so vile? So pick and choose the portions of that you want to address that you feel you can.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of folks would call my grandfather different things. Bird would call him Dwayne,
Mhm.
for example. Randy called him Jim. Charlie called him Jim. And so there are a lot of people in the project, they would say things like, you have to wear many hats uh, in life. And so the persona of Jim Reeves was simply a hat that he wore and a role that he played. And so that role in the church, after they killed him off, it was fairly easy to simply just be Mark Twain Sweet. He worked for the Union Pacific Railroad, and so that job provided him the ability to travel under the guise of I'm traveling for work. And it allowed him the ability to be moved to different locations. He was in places such as Green River, Wyoming, Omaha, Nebraska. He got out of Omaha, I believe, right before the shit hit the fan with the Franklin conspiracy
Oh,
cover. And
okay.
so my grandfather was in Omaha for UP down there. And so they were able to move him around in that way. But when he was done being Jim Reeves, he just was Mark Twain Sweet. And so it was I remember him telling me he had to have surgery, some plastic surgery after his supposed death because for obvious reasons. But he also had a ring. There's one of the images on my website I provide where you'll see him sitting on a couch with my grandmother and my father and mother. Well, he's covering his ring on his left hand, and this ring was very significant for that character, Jim Reeves. It was a defining thing, and so I can remember my grandfather or my father saying to my grandfather, "You covered your hand, right? You didn't let that ring be in the picture." Because that would have been a definer of who he was. And so he wasn't allowed to let things like that would show who he had been out into public. He had to keep that all hidden. And then I can remember, he liked playing that character. He liked the notoriety. He sung all the time. Like you go on a trip with grandpa and you might as well bring your ears and your voice because you're gonna be listening and singing. And he could sing, and one of his favorite songs was Penny Candy. He would sing that all the time, Penny Candy. And he'd just sing that and all kinds of stuff, just always singing.
It sounds like you have some good memories.
I do, which
Good.
is it's a torture for me because he wasn't all bad. My grandfather, he was really pissed at my uncle when he put me through suicide programming. For example, after the failed Boise mission, he was really mad at my uncle, but he only had so much control in the situation because of the agency. And so, yeah, he could be a good person, and then he could be a monster, a pure monster. And so I, I don't know if I talked at all about when he raped me in McCall, Idaho.
Mm-mm.
This was after we'd come back from our trip back east. It was on July 4th of 1993. I remember the exact date. We went to McCall to stay with some relatives there in their cabin. And he could be the nicest, most wonderful old man. And then he could just be a monster. And so he brought a knife with him on that trip. And he and the individual we were staying with, who was a relative, I can't remember his name, we went into the movie store to rent a movie for the night. And we were all going to watch it. And there was a young man that worked in the movie store. Well, my grandfather kept trying to talk this young man into coming over after he was done with work to the cabin. And my grandfather would not have had good intention in mind for this young man. And then luckily, the young man didn't show up. But what that meant was my grandfather took out all of that aggression on me. And so he cut me up pretty good that night and he raped me. And it was a horrible experience. Basically, he took a knife and he stuck it in my chest, which is a common practice. I've talked about that a little bit. and he was trying to get the message out of me that I had been made to carry the bird. He wanted to hear it, but I wouldn't give it to him, and so I didn't give it to him. And then he raped me, and he took a knife, and he was going to remove my male genitalia, and he put a very large scar between my. This is something that's pretty difficult. Through between my anus and my scrotum, and it was a horrid night. And then he finally quit and went away. And in the morning, I woke up with this huge wound, not understanding what had even happened.
How old were you?
That was in 93. I had just turned 16, I believe, that year. I was 15 or 16. And so um, I, I had that injury and I carried it until it healed, but I was made to forget about it. And I've seen it before and wondered, what on earth is this even? What has happened to me? But I could never remember it until that memory came back and I was able to remember that. And so he could be a wonderful, kind, joyful, singing. Like before I remembered stuff in 2017, I thought he was my hero. He was my hero. I loved my grandfather. I
You
couldn't
know,
say.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to ask you real quick. Do you think that this dichotomy of personality is more indicative of a personality disorder, or do you think he was a DID individual and he would have to switch alters in order to be able to do something like that to his grandson?
I don't quite understand. He was definitely a multiple. Um,
Okay.
he had DID,
Okay.
and he would move between personalities, but he would remember that he was Jim Reeves, for example, and that he played that role. He would remember things and I was never allowed to remember anything. And so that kind of surprises me a little bit because at my wedding, when my wife and I got married, my wife's family is into country music.
Mhm.
And so when we got married, my grandfather talked to some of my wife's brothers, and one of them um, he talked to knew who Jim Reeves was. And my grandpa, I remember him telling my uncle and me how just, how awesome that was. Like, oh, he knows who that was, and he was so excited. And, so he knew. And so I don't quite understand that dynamic entirely. Yeah, but he was definitely a multiple because he could be the most wonderful and then he could switch. And it was like the devil had come out in the man. Yeah.
Can we talk about switching for just a moment? I'm hoping that
Yeah.
you can share with the viewers what happens in the mind when you switch from one personality to another. Are you aware of it? Can you feel it? Is there a push pull? I mean, what does that actually feel like inside when you are switching from one altar to another?
It's an absolutely horrid feeling. It is a feeling of a complete loss of control. And so back, this was when my daughter was young. It must have been around, late 2000s, right around in there. Well, my wife and I went down to visit my grandmother and my family. We'd often go down to the Boise Valley to visit them and just keep up with my family. Well, we were in my grandmother's living room, and I handed my youngest daughter to my the man my grandmother had married after my grandfather passed.
Okay.
His name was Reed. I handed my daughter to Reed, and Reed sat her down with him, and he immediately began to tickle her in a way that I was not comfortable with. And at the moment that he did that, I dissociated. And I could feel it hit me. And it's like being, they call it monarch programming and they connect a butterfly to it because you feel extremely lightheaded, like you just go light. It's almost like if you'd held your breath and you were about to pass out. It's almost like you're about to pass out kind of feeling, and you lose all control. And it's like you go to a dark place in your mind, and that loss of control. After that incident, when I lost control of that situation, just that simple situation, my grandmother stepped in when this happened, and she took my daughter from Reed, and she said, don't touch her like that. We won't have that in this house anymore. We're not involved with that anymore. And she handed my child to me, or to my wife, I forget which, but she got him away. And that relieved my mind of that stress. And I came back down and I worked through it. But I was so mad at myself. It freaked me out. I was like, oh my goodness, what happened? What happened right there? How could I have completely lost all ability to even function? But when it happened, it was so familiar to me, that feeling of that lightheaded and complete loss of control, and like you just left, that it was scary, but I couldn't understand it at that time. All I knew was that a creepy old man was treating my daughter inappropriately, and I had no way to move. I just became stuck. And so that really freaked me out and it made me mad. But that was before I started to remember things. And so I didn't understand what had happened to me, but it really freaked me out. And so that feeling, it's like your head is full of butterflies and your consciousness just lost it all. You just get really light and your head goes and things go dark. Things might go red, like when you're being tortured and forced into a personality, it might go red because of that pain and that extreme trauma you're dealing with. So, does that make sense, Madeline?
It does. I believe so. And probably because I've worked with a lot of individuals that are DID and they've explained their experience. So I was just wondering what yours had been for the audience sake. But when you switch over, you're not aware of the actual occurrence at the time and you're not aware of the time per se, right? So you could actually go into an altar and be gone for quite some time and not even realize it. Is that
Um,
for you?
I don't know about that. I would argue that you are put into an altar and you're aware.
Okay.
I was aware a lot of times that, and those altars could be arrogant and mean, and they could think that the other Johnny, the other me, is stupid, and that all Mormons with moral value are stupid, and that personality will take over, and then that person, because for example, when I was with Hinckley in that presentation that I talked about last time,
Mhm.
when I was pushed over the rainbow and into another personality, everything came back. And so for me, a lot of times it'll come back. You'll be pushed over that threshold into a horrible place, into an altar, and then that altar, that altar remembers everything that altar lived through. And so you'll remember everything that that altar lived through. But when they're done with using you in that altar, it's compartmentalized again. And now you're back to your base personality who can't remember any of it.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Okay. And so your base personality as Johnny, do you recognize that something has happened and you just don't know what, or are you aware that you have switched?
I it varies. That varies a little bit in my memory.
Okay.
Because like when my grandmother, when we were with Reed and I started to switch, maybe it was because I didn't switch all the way, but all I knew is that the feeling was familiar and I didn't like it. But
Okay.
when I was with the prophet and I was pushed to that point, I could remember everything that that personality had lived through. And in my mind, it was like, oh, crud. Oh, crap. I remember this. This is bad. This is going to be really bad. And then you're brought out of that again and you can't remember what happened. And so that has varied for me according to the intensity of the trauma and the personality that you're moved into.
How have you started to either integrate the different aspects of your mind or cope with the fact that that has occurred in your life? And how do you live from your base personality now?
It's a really good question, Madeline. It is really difficult to deal with and to work through. I try to keep a very normal life. I have to provide for my family. I have to be a father. I have to live a normal life. And so I have to go to work. And there's some days when it is really hard. And I've told my employer that I suffer from PTSD, and there is times when I won't be able to come in because I just won't be able to function. And it's come really close to that a couple times, but something that helps me heal is work and being able to take my mind off of those things and just let it sink in. I feel like time is super important to healing. You have to give yourself time. And for me, um, it's really hard. It's just hard because you're remembering these people you killed, these things you were involved with, that you witnessed, that you were involved in, and some of them, it's just hard to accept. There's some things I was made to do that I don't know. It's
I
pretty
want to
rough.
remember that.
No, you don't. And so, no, you don't want to.
You
Once
want
you
to know what
remember,
happens, but you don't want to know the details.
yeah, but you
I
have to
get it.
really, yeah, you got to really work through those details to understand it. And so that can be really difficult. And there's some days, yeah, where it's just really, really tough. And sometimes, people notice something's Johnny's a little edgy today and just give him his space. And
Yeah.
yeah. And so I just have to take my day by day, minute by minute. And one thing that's nice is they don't harass me too much here. I'm away from the network that I was in before, several miles. And so I distanced myself greatly. And so I'm able to relax a little bit in that way. But it's definitely difficult to work through, and I still have issues of that I don't understand when I'll start to switch and move into an altar, and it's can be difficult to recognize, but I've learned to recognize it, and it'll happen, but I have to work through it. Uh, and the key to working through it is knowing
Yeah.
it's even possible, and that you're in a personality that you need to deal with. And so, yeah, so it can be difficult, but there's hope. We're strong. Human beings are strong, and the truth is much stronger than the lies I was fed my entire life. And my desire is to heal.
Mhm.
Uh, and but there's a part of you, a part of me that's afraid of healing because you become so familiar with all that pain. It's a part of your life. It's a part of who you are, and you're so accustomed to it. And so I have to work on letting it go.
I
So
see. You know, I always like to end on a positive note and leave people with hope and encouragement. So, will you speak a little more on that in terms of how you've um, coped with the fact that you have to be comfortable with healing and letting that go? What have you done for yourself to facilitate your integration and your healing process?
yeah, yeah, that's a good question. It's a big part of it is letting go of ego.
Mhm.
You have to surrender. For me, I don't have all the answers. I know that something's wrong, that something messed up happened. I know a great many of the details that explain it. I'm a trauma-based mind slave and a survivor of the CIA's MK Ultra program. And so for me, family is important as far as those that I love, removing myself from my abuse space. That's something that was really difficult, but it's in God's hands in the end. And so another thing that really helps me is I have a view of the big picture. And so it saddens me a lot, Madeline, to go through life and watch people uh, work through their shallow desires. They all want a fancy car, a big fancy house, a swimming pool out back. They want status, all these things that don't mean anything. They don't mean anything. When we pass away, those things are gone. And what you're left with is your soul. And so I died. I was put through suicide programming. You are aware of this. And they stopped my heart. And I went to the other side and I met those people on the other side that lived and had died. And they gave me a lot of strength because they forgave me, which is very powerful. They let me know that it wasn't my fault, the things that I've been made to do. I saw people that I had been made to kill, and they came to me when I was taken to the other side. There was a volume of people who came to see me. When we pass away, they all come to see us. We're coming home. And so that gives me a huge amount of strength, knowing that this life, we only live until we die, and we all die. And when I go back, I want to know that I did everything I could to share the truth that I know to help others. And all these other
What
things, they're
forgiveness do to your soul?
the what?
What did that forgiveness do for your soul? Just knowing that they didn't hold you responsible for your actions and knew that it was out of your control. How did that must have been an amazing feeling.
It is. Yeah,
Overwhelming, I would imagine.
it is. It is overwhelming. Completely overwhelming because we have to not only do they have to forgive me, I have to forgive myself. And so I really appreciate that message that they brought to me. And I try diligently to work through the ability to forgive myself.
I hope you're there because you are
Yeah.
absolutely amazing. Everybody that I've talked to about you, who've commented about you, the one thing that is undeniable is that you've got such an amazing, sweet spirit. It's not just your last name, it's you're so gentle. And the fact that you give of yourself, which is not easy. Sharing this stuff is not easy, and you do pay a price every time you tell your story, but you know it's important. And so you give of this willingly in order to help others heal and learn. And I hope people, the listeners, appreciate that about you because it's not without sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's worth it.
Mhm.
It's worth it because it has to stop.
It does.
Yeah. And so if we all just learn to talk about it. So
Mhm.
I appreciate you, Madeline. Thank you for talking to me about it.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So, your website is mormonmonarch.com. That's where people can go to read your story, your journalings, and then your book is going to be released sometime in the next year or so, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay,
I'll
great.
let you know.
Oh, perfect. I hope
Yeah.
you'll come back again.
Yeah, I will do my best.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here. I am so grateful to have gotten to know you a bit and for the time that you take to help us learn. If you guys want to read more of his story, go to MormonMonarch.com. His wife, Kate Story, has her website. Will you tell us what that is?
Yeah, that's ldsmindcontrol.com.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you can hear from her perspective. She also has an interview that I did with her on what it's like to be married to a mind control slave and how that discovery and healing process goes for those around them. So please take the time to listen to her interview and to go to her website. You guys can always reach me at galacticstoryteller@gmail.com. Like and subscribe, share this video. And you guys, with your comments, thank you so much. Be kind, be generous of spirit with your comments. But if you have questions, just write them out in a respectful way and we will do what we can to answer them. So thank you so much. And you guys have a great day. We'll see you in the next video.
Thank you, Madeline.
Thanks, JR.